Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Ji Ha-ham. As North Korea increases nuclear capabilities, there are growing calls among South Korean people that the country needs its own nuclear weapons. The White House has released declassified photos showing Russian rail cars possibly transporting North Korean weapons to the battlefield in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has nominated a special envoy for North Korean human rights that has been vacant for 6 years. Today, we'll discuss these and more.
Obviously condemn North Korea's actions, and we urge North Korea to cease these deliveries to Wagner immediately.
Congratulate Julie Turner on her nomination as the U.S. Special Envoy on North Korean human rights issues, and we look forward to the Senate confirming her, we hope, swiftly.
In the studio with me is Mark Fitzpatrick, Associate Fellow and former Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies Americas. Mr. Fitzpatrick was Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Non-Proliferation at the State Department. Also joining me is Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Mr. Klingner served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to our program.
Oh, thank you for having us.
Both.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, we hear quite often these days about this issue, South Korea's own nuclear development. This idea was not fully supported by Washington for decades, including many experts. I mean, they have said that it will hurt the alliance, and they warned South Korea that it will face serious consequences. But so it was a big no for decades. But Washington seems like it is taking this issue differently. So instead of saying absolutely no, we see a statement from the U.S. that are focusing on reassuring South Korea. How would you read this?
Yes, Mr. Han, I think you're absolutely right that for many years it was a very strong no. The United States has had for many administrations a universal non-proliferation policy opposing acquisition of nuclear weapons from any of its allies. And you could see that with Taiwan, with Japan, with South Korea, and other countries. So now, I think you're right that the attitude has changed a little bit because we see that this issue is such a big issue in South Korea, and U.S. administration has to take that into account in how they respond. They're not going to just forcefully, slap South Korean government and say no, no, no. That's not the way you deal with a valuable ally. You deal with it quietly and let them, know themselves that it's a bad idea. And we saw very quickly that President Yoon came around and told the Wall Street Journal that South Korea absolutely will adhere to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and that it values and accepts U.S. extended deterrence. But let there be no doubt among official Washington and almost all of the Washington security community, with a few exceptions, we don't think it's a good idea at all for South Korea to have nuclear weapons. It would add only a marginal benefit, if anything, and have big costs. It's costly to deploy them. It will provoke China and Russia, who now will target South Korea. North Korea might think this is a good time to attack before South Korea can actually produce nuclear weapons. It would be a slap to the United States saying we don't trust you as allies. It would incur big economic costs because no country could provide fuel for South Korea's 25 nuclear reactors, which supply so much electricity to the South Korean electric grid. And it would change South Korea's standing in the world, where today it is one of the global good guys, a leader in so many fields, and suddenly South Korea would become, if not a rogue state, a much less welcome member of the international community if it pulled out of the NPT.
Yeah, but we have asked these questions quite many times, but we see, growing skepticism of the U.S. security guarantee because not many people, think that U.S. would give up a city or endanger a city like Los Angeles for South Korea.
You know, we understand the concern in South Korea, and that's why there is so much more attention now devoted to strengthening the extended deterrence, to strengthening the discussions that the United States has with its South Korean partner in the different forums that were set up for discussing extended deterrence. But this issue about would the United States sacrifice Seattle for Seoul? It's a kind of a fun thing to say, but is it real? Look, for decades in the European theater, America's European allies faced a much more powerful threat from the Soviet Union. Massive nuclear weapon arsenal. Did Germany go nuclear? Did Poland? Did Italy? No, because they were able to believe in the U.S. extended deterrence. And now we have this minor threat from North Korea. United States is not going to abandon its alliance relationship because of this.
Right. What about UK and France?
So UK and France, each of them have different circumstances from the very beginning. They were victors in World War II. United Kingdom was part of the American nuclear weapons program at the beginning. It was jointly developed with the United Kingdom. And then after a couple of years, the U.S. Congress said, we just want to do this alone. So United Kingdom, you have to go your own route. But they already had a beginning to do it. And then France, well, France is France. They always want to have an independent acting position, an independent deterrence. So yes, they got their own nuclear weapons early on, but all the other European countries didn't. So what does South Korea want to compare itself with? United Kingdom and France? Or isn't it more like Italy?
Mr. Klingner, what do you read? Do you sense the atmosphere is changing? Because this subject for a long time has been a taboo in the U.S., but we now see quite many experts are talking about, discussing about it, and making some suggestions. So at least for now, it has become a topic for many Korea watchers.
It's certainly been a topic of discussion, but I don't think there has been really a change in attitude of what the U.S. policy should be. For years, if not decades, there was discussion in South Korea about reintroduction of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons or an indigenous nuclear weapons program or nuclear sharing, but it was really a fringe advocacy. Now it's moved into mainstream discussion, I think driven by the growing North Korean threat, the fear of Seattle for Seoul or San Francisco for Seoul, given that North Korea has ICBMs that can target the United States. Many officials in Tokyo and Seoul expressed concern if President Trump is reelected that it could lead to resumed threats to remove U.S. forces, et cetera, and also South Korean national pride. Sort of if France and UK can have it, why not us? So it may have driven the discussion to the mainstream, but successive South Korean administrations have said they are not interested in pursuing the nuclear options. President Yoon has seemingly advocated it and then walked it back or had his officials walk it back. The U.S. has pointed out, I think more behind the scenes, the consequences of such actions, as Mark pointed out. But what we're seeing is, as reporters and others are discussing the issue, the U.S. has had to respond because it wasn't really a topic of discussion before. The U.S. is trying to point out not only all of the things we've done in our reassurances, but also our physical actions that show how integrated we are with South Korea's defense, including Combined Forces Command. But we're discussing it behind the scenes, and there are ongoing official negotiations or talks. And I think the U.S. is being very forthcoming in trying to discern what are South Korea's objectives, what would it take to provide greater reassurance, and the U.S., I think, is trying to allay those concerns. We can't do everything that South Korea would want. But I think it's best, again, as Mark said, this is best handled quietly, as it is being done right now.
Yeah, but the U.S. Has expedited extended deterrence, to address South Korean people's concern.
I think the U.S. has pointed out we have a treaty where we have vowed to defend South Korea. We've had extended deterrence guarantee. We've had numerous years of presidential and other senior officials' comments about our commitment. We can point to the names of 36,000 Americans on the memorial wall at the Korean War Memorial showing our commitment to defending South Korea. And we have, of course, 28,500 of our sons and daughters in uniform deployed in harm's way as another sign of our commitment, as well as the integrated defense command that we have with Seoul. We've also resumed large-scale military exercises and the rotational deployment of U.S. strategic assets, which were canceled in 2018, and now those have resumed. And both military leaders have pledged that those will continue and certainly expand this year. So the U.S. is trying to have a lot of verbal assurances as well as tangible commitments, including the resumption of these assets. Now, whether we have a nuclear planning group or some other bilateral mechanism that evolves from the behind-the-scenes talks, we'll have to see. But I think the U.S. is trying to allay the concerns, and but we have seen President Yoon most recently has said that South Korea is not interested in an indigenous nuclear weapons program, nor in having the U.S. reintroduce tactical nuclear weapons onto the peninsula.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, Secretary Blinken is heading to China next month. So can we expect a situation where Secretary Blinken warns China, if you don't do anything about North Korea, then South Korea will go nuclear, Japan will go nuclear? Some suggest that this would be one way to press China and could be a very useful tool for the United States.
Yeah, I saw that former National Security Advisor John Bolton implicitly recommended this in an op-ed in the Washington Post this morning. It's a talking point that has been used in the past. I remember Vice President Cheney said this to China back in the George W. Bush administration. I thought it was foolish for Cheney to have said that, and Blinken is not going to say that because number one, China knows very well how its neighbors are reacting to North Korea. They don't need to be told. And secondly, if Blinken or any U.S. official were to say that publicly, it looks like it's giving a green light to Japan and to South Korea to develop nuclear weapons, and that's the last signal we want to give. So there's a way to deal with China, but China doesn't prioritize nuclear weapons in North Korea, and I think that's a problem. And we need to talk to China about that. But playing a Japan card or playing a South Korean nuclear card, I don't think helps at all.
Okay. All right, now let's talk about the weapons transaction between Russia and North Korea. So while both countries deny, White House has provided ample visual evidence last week, and the Treasury Department imposed sanctions on individuals and entities linked to Wagner Group. The Wagner Group itself has been sanctioned by the United States, along with several others, including Japan, but not South Korea. So, Mr. Fitzpatrick, Washington would want South Korea to fully join their efforts or strategy on Russia and China as well. But in South Korea's perspective, it has maintained strategic cooperative relations with these countries, Russia and China. But U.S. wants South Korea to become their strategic partner in Indo-Pacific at the same time.
Well, the United States certainly would like South Korea on its side as it deals with these troublesome countries. But we realize that the cases of China and Russia are very different, particularly as it pertains to South Korea's situation. Russia is an egregious violator of the global order, invading a neighboring country without any reason, and creating war crime after war crime. South Korea absolutely should join the global alliance against Russia and sanction it. And I'm sorry that South Korea hasn't done that to the extent that other countries have. With regard to China, it's a different situation. China's violations are more subtle. They're not such violations of global order. And South Korea has such an important trade relationship with China. We understand that. So we give South Korea a bye, as it were, in dealing with China, but not in dealing with Russia.
Klingner? Do you have anything to add?
Well, first of all, when the White House releases the satellite photos, some would say, well, a single photo of rail cars doesn't prove that North Korea is involved with Russia. And as a personal aside, I had to smile when I saw those photos because I started in the intelligence community as an imagery analyst, and they're still using the same font and little inset map as when I was there in the 1980s. But I also know that certainly one photo does not represent the entirety of the intelligence. Similar to back in 2007 when the U.S. released, very poor quality imagery of what was a Syrian nuclear reactor. Obviously, we would have had a lot more photos as well as other sources of information. So presumably, there is much stronger information. Under the Moon administration, South Korea was slow in responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in a way seemed to be shamed into sanctions and other international response. What we've seen now is South Korea catching up to the rest of the community on efforts against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On its efforts towards China in response to its transgressions, South Korea, through successive administrations, has been more reluctant than other nations to call out Beijing by name. And we've seen that recently in the Indo-Pacific strategy of the Yoon administration, where there's only one reference to China, and it's in a positive light, whereas the Japanese national security and national defense strategies are much more clear in not only calling out the transgressions that China has done, but identifying Beijing as the perpetrator. And that's consistent with joint statements by both the Japanese and South Korean leaders. So President Yoon has said South Korea will assume a larger regional role, which we hope and we would embrace. One of that has to be standing up more firmly for the principles and values that democracies share, which South Korea has been reluctant to do, even though Japan and Australia, both of whom, for whom China is their largest trading partners, have been more willing to do than Seoul.
All right, let's move on to the North Korean drone issue. Mr. Fitzpatrick, the United Nations Command announced that both South Korea and North Korea violated the armistice by sending drones to each other. But as we know, the North Koreans sent their drones first to South Korea, and then South Korea responded by sending drones. So it happened after. So the South Korean military said that it was a self-defense measure, which is not restricted by the armistice. How did you read this?
Well, first of all, I read that. I thought it was very interesting that the UN command, basically a Western institution, is criticizing both sides. It's being extraordinarily fair. And of course, everyone realizes that North Korea did it first and South Korea's was a response and, could be justifiable. But I think the fact that the UN command said both of you violated shows that it has a reputation for fairness, for independence, and it only enhances its position in the world, I think.
Okay. Mr. Klingner, the UNC said North Korea committed a violation, while South Korea constituted an armistice breach. In South Korea, both words were used to define their violations. Isn't there a difference in nuance between these two words?
I'm not sure if there's a legalistic difference between the two terms, but the UN command has many roles, one of which is enforcing the armistice and to identify violations to it. So again, sort of taking a lawyerly approach, anything that sort of transgresses across the military demarcation line would be seen as a violation.
Right. South Korea said that it had consulted with USFK commander, before they sent their drones to North Korea. The commander of USFK is also a commander of UNC. So can you see a contradiction here?
Well, the South Korean military later said that they did not see the drones as an emergency. They saw it as routine. The South Korean action was not a response where it was seen as imminent threat to their own soldiers. The USFK, CFC, UNC commander is all right now the same person. And each of those organizations and the commander of that organization has different roles, responsibilities, and missions. And sometimes they can seem in conflict with each other. So a UNC ruling would be that an action by South Korea could be a violation, whereas it might be seen as a proportional response from a purely military point of view.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me switch gears a little bit, Mr. Fitzpatrick. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently in his book said Kim Jong-un considers U.S. troops in South Korea as protection against Chinese dominance. So Mr. Pompeo hinted that North Korea sees China as threat to their security. I mean, did you also find that other North Korean officials feel that way?
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting that he reported this 4 years later, but it's very interesting. It's not the first time we've heard a North Korean leader say this. I recall at the 2000 North-South summit that Kim told Kim Dae-jung this in more or less the same words, that the U.S. troops could remain in South Korea after unification because they would be useful as peacekeepers, and this was seen as a way of saying that, yeah, we fear China. But it's interesting that Kim Jong-un also said this, and apparently in more direct words. I think it shows the value of having discussions with the top guy. I applaud the fact that Mike Pompeo went to North Korea and had these talks. I'm sorry that nothing came out of it. And I think it does show that, what North Korea says officially in its bureaucratic statements can be different from what the top leader actually thinks.
Yeah, Mr. Klingner.
It certainly was an interesting comment, and I think sort of two issues. One is if North Korea really believes that, as Kim Jong-il had said it earlier, then why do they repeatedly say that the presence of U.S. troops in South Korea is the single biggest impediment to progress on denuclearization talks? So I think they're clearly on both sides of the fence for when it is most advantageous to them. But it also does show a consistency with statements by really all three generations of North Korean leaders about their concerns about China. So some people think China controls North Korea, that they can tell North Korea what to do. They tell them to jump. North Korea says how high. That's clearly not the case, and it's certainly a misinterpretation of 5,000 years of Korean history. So the relationship is complicated. It is not lips and teeth, as the old phrase was, but and North Korea has often said, we have to be more concerned about China than the Americans because the Americans are far away. But I think it does reflect the complicated Chinese-North Korean relationship. But I think it was also a way of trying to gain traction with the U.S. negotiator at the time.
Okay, Mr. Klingner, the Biden administration finally nominated North Korean human rights envoy. It's been vacant for 6 years, meaning that this Biden administration left this position open for 2 years. What do you think the reasons for this delay?
Well, first of all, it's very welcome news. It will elevate North Korean human rights as a component of overall U.S. policy on North Korea. In talking with some people, it had seemed there were some bureaucratic issues, administrative issues, et cetera, that may have prevented an earlier nomination by a North Korean human rights envoy in this administration. Clearly, there were 4 years without the position filled during the Trump administration, which would seem to be more of a lower prioritization given to human rights, particularly given the ongoing, at that time, discussions and negotiations with North Korea. So it's very welcome news. We hope that it will indicate that the U.S. will elevate its focus, its criticism of North Korean human rights violations and really crimes against humanity. Also, we've seen President Yoon has also elevated human rights as an issue in his policy, whereas under the Moon administration there had been, I think, a deliberate downplaying of North Korean human rights violations because it was seen as impeding President Moon's outreach to North Korea. So I think now we have both the U.S. and South Korea working to uphold values that both of our democracies hold very dear.
Okay, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you both for joining us.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thanks, this was fun.
Okay, thank you. That does it for today's Washington Talk. Please join us again next week for more analysis.